Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give everyone a minute to join and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get started and let people keep coming in as I give some brief introductions. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Earth Day. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Celebrating Earth Day Through Community Environmental Work. I'm Madison Calhoun, the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to give some brief notes before turning things over to our fantastic moderator, Ariel King. Today's program will feature a discussion about community environmental law work. It will touch on the history of Earth Day, the limitations of current federal environmental law, and go into detail on how law students, scientists, and lawyers can get involved with organizations that address past environmental harms and provide communities in need with resources to address their environmental concerns. I want to thank Ariel King, Scott Badenoch, and Raj Pandya for taking the time to be with us today. They have prepared some fantastic content for all of you, and we at ELI so appreciate their time and energy. For those in the audience, please do feel free to ask questions in the questions box on Zoom throughout the presentation as you think of them. We will try to get to as many as we can. I'll now go ahead and introduce our moderator, Ariel. Ariel King is the Environmental Justice Staff Attorney at the Environmental Law Institute. Ariel brings to ELI a background in environmental racism analysis, political ecology, critical race theory, sustainability, civil rights law, and integrating equity and environmental justice considerations into climate action plans. She's passionate about making environment education inclusive and accessible to all. Ariel holds a JD and a master's in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School and a BA from Bard College at Simon's Rock. Ariel, thank you so much for your time today, and I will turn things over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Madison. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. I want to thank you all for being here for this important conversation. Environmental justice embraces the principle that all people deserve equal access to environmental protection and enforcement, recognizing that this, both historically and currently, often is not the case, and communities that receive the least benefits are experiencing the greatest environmental burdens. As the Environmental Justice Staff Attorney at ELI, I am so glad that this session is happening on Earth Day, a day created to spread awareness about the harm inflicted upon our natural environment and the need to take action to protect our planet. Today, we have two dynamic speakers in the community advocacy space, Dr. Raj Pandya and Scott Wilson Badenoch Jr. So to not take any more time away from this important conversation, I'm going to turn the floor over to our two speakers to introduce themselves, and we'll dive right in. And as Madison mentioned, as we're working through this panel, I do want to invite you all to add questions to the Q&A chat section, and we will get to as many of them as we can at the end. And so, Scott, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got engaged in legal community support work?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first off, I'm a senior clinical fellow at UC Irvine's Environmental Law Clinic that serves nothing but EJ communities and EJ issues. I'm also at ELI, the founder of BRIGHT, which is our Blight Revitalization Initiative for Green, Healthy Towns, where we facilitate area-wide planning and corridor projects for communities of color and EJ communities. And lastly, our ELI Pro Bono Clearinghouse, which is how Raj and I have been working together now for well over a year to facilitate communities reaching the professionals that they need. And in our case, lawyers, and Raj's scientists. So a little backstory is I've been an environmental lawyer my whole career. I worked on large-scale cleanups all over the world. And time again, when visiting these sites and understanding the brownfield problem that the industrial legacy has left us, I realized that the communities around them were communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income communities, and not just like some of the time, all of the time. And it hit me very starkly after a few of those that the social justice issues that I was very concerned with and the environmental protection issues I was very concerned with were actually squarely overlapping. And that this body of work is environmental justice. At the time, I didn't understand that. It took me years to fully educate myself on that body of law and the body of writing about community lawyering, empowerment lawyering, environmental justice more broadly, but also very specifically from federal efforts to state to local. And then I realized that that's what I was, as I was an environmental justice lawyer, because I couldn't look past that fact anymore. It wasn't just about cleaning up the brownfield. It was about facilitating that community in what was a dire scenario where people were genuinely dying from the toxicity in these sites, and where babies were covered in pox because of the mine tailings surrounding the community, or kids were playing in fields that were well beyond legal limits from toxicity plumes that had migrated. These sorts of things were just too stark to look past. And at that point, I dedicated my career to environmental justice. And one of the big efforts in that is bringing this ELI Pro Bono Clearinghouse to bear so that communities across the country and beyond, because we do have international reach, can ensure that their matters will find the legal representation that they need, but also beyond that, and this is where I'll pass to Raj, that they also have the science that they need to facilitate any of their goals. So thank you, Ariel, and I'll pass to Raj.
Thank you so much. Raj, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So one of the things I've been working on kind of personally is inclusive introductions. So I'm going to do an inclusive introduction. My name is Raj Pandya. My pronouns are he, him. For those of you who might be in an environment where you have trouble seeing or have trouble seeing yourself, I'm in a blue room with lots of art on the wall. I'm wearing a black shirt. I have tortoiseshell glasses on, and I have black-gray hair. And honestly, it's more gray than black. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Boulder, Colorado. And this is land that was taken from the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne Indians, and that 48 contemporary Indian communities are tied to this land we call Colorado. I share this acknowledgement to remind myself in my work as a person, as a scientist, as a professional, that this work is about acknowledging and repairing past harms and working to make a more just future for everyone. And I know that all of us are sitting in indigenous lands, and so invite everybody to kind of think about that and how that influences their work. I work in a project called the Thriving Earth Exchange, which, as Scott says, helps connect communities with scientists. We recognize that a scientist isn't enough, but it's helpful. So that's kind of our philosophy going in, and we try to really focus our work around three principles. The first principle is the community drives the bus. It is never about scientists coming in and telling communities what they should do, what they should worry about, what is important to them. It's about asking communities what they aspire to be, what their priorities are, and finding ways that science can support those priorities. And that word priorities is really important to us. I had a mayor who told me once he was tired of rich cities having priorities and poor cities having needs. And so we lean into this idea of priorities to acknowledge that everybody has knowledge and expertise and aspirations about the place they live. Second principle for Thriving Earth Exchange is it's about that science is a human right, that every community deserves the right to ask and answer questions about the places they live and work and play. And that when you have access to science, you have access to a kind of power, and you can use that power to affect change. And that kind of leads us to the third principle, which is try to affect change. We're a community of scientists, right? So um, sometimes we have to remind ourselves that a scientific paper is not an outcome. An outcome is something different, something tangible in the community. And so we try to work towards those outcomes. And like I give you a couple of examples of projects that have been exciting for us. In Houston, their community was noticed that they were flooding way more than everyone around them. And so we helped them connect to a scientist, a hydrologist who helped them collect data about that flooding. They were able to show that that flooding was not because of natural causes, but because of conditions in the built environment. And they used that to raise awareness with their local city and even state and eventually federal to reallocate funds towards that neighborhood. Up until that time, the primary delivery of rebuilding funds was based on a cost benefit analysis. This data about what that did over time and meant that they started to allocate that fund based on some other kinds of indices like social vulnerability, right? So just to be completely explicit, up until this time, if you had a $200,000 house that was destroyed in a flood and it would cost $100,000 to elevate it, it wasn't considered a good investment. So it wasn't prioritized for rebuilding money. An $800,000 house with $100,000 to lift it was considered a good investment. So it ended up disproportionately benefiting more wealthy communities and marginalizing less wealthy communities. Another cool project we worked on was in New Orleans. It was the I-10 corridor. This is a freeway that was built through a predominantly African-American community 60 years ago. And Amy Stelly, this amazing community leader, wanted to get rid of that freeway. That was her goal in life. We helped her collect data about the water, air, and noise pollution. She took that data all the way to Congress, and part of the new infrastructure package that was passed includes $1 billion for highway removal in her communities and communities like hers. It's Earth Day, so I really want to acknowledge one project, not a Thriving Earth Exchange project, but a project that really was kind of instrumental for me. A guy named Bob Goff, who was a lawyer, an anthropologist. He was the head of Intertribal COO, which stands for Council on Utility Policy, but it's a cool name. He sued a rural electric co-op that had been built and was powered by dams, partly powered by dams that had flooded indigenous lands. And he sued for the right of indigenous communities to buy and be part of that power co-op, to buy electricity. What he realized was that the right to buy was also the right to sell. And so he worked with the Rosebud Reservation to build the first turbine on indigenous lands. And that turbine helped launch a kind of decarbonization of that energy grid. So really clever example and a nice, I think, illustration of the point Scott made, that like none of this is just science or just law. It's the messy, beautiful combination of both that gets things done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And so, Raj, you already touched on it a bit, but it's Earth Day. Today is the 52nd celebration of Earth Day in the United States.
Sorry, I'm not part of this team. No, I'm with Flo. I'm with Flo.
The first celebration on this day was in 1970, and it's thought to be the birth of the modern environmental movement. By the end of 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency had been created, the Clean Air Act had been enacted, and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and many others followed in following years. Unfortunately, since their enactment, we've seen how unequal protection and enforcement of these laws have impacted Black, Brown, Indigenous, other people of color, and low-income people across the country. And so I would love to hear each of your thoughts on the gaps that exist within these legal frameworks and the role of science and law in producing more equitable outcomes to environmental protection and enforcement. And so I'll let whoever wants to go first, go first.
Well, I'll just say, just because the Earth Day is, obviously such an important day for environmental lawyers. It ushered in our entire world, right? All of the big bills and everything that we live in, right? But I'll also say that the laws that we passed were largely, and this is kind of be a bit ironic, but were quantitative bills. They were bills that said, yes, actually you can pollute, but only so much, right? And we are going to measure that to a very fine scientific level to make sure that things are safe or whatever else. And it really came down to the numbers and the math. And one of the biggest things that's actually been lacking in the environmental protection regime is the qualitative aspects. And this is what environmental justice seeks to bring to the regime, that says the human aspect is also very, very important. And let me just give you one example real quick. So a lot of the new EJ tools are using metrics, right? So you could say, okay, if your community is 85% X, Y, and Z, then you are this or that, right? Well, what if you're 84.9, right? Does that mean you're really not? No. So a lot of the new laws that have been coming in have that quantitative number, but then they have a qualitative check on it so that you can find a way to navigate that, the brutality of the numbers, right? So anyway, as we are in this 52nd Earth Day, I hope for a new era where we bring in qualitative aspects into our environmental protection regime to support those quantitative. Now, on the other side, of course, communities like Flint, they really were able to make their case when the scientists came to bear and said, yes, that brown, weird looking water is actually 1,000 times the legal limit. And then their lived experience, which is qualitative, was backed up by the data, which is quantitative. And this combination is how we really effectuate change. And the history of environmental justice is really about that precise thing, is the data backing up the lived experience of these communities and finally causing the government to do something about it, right? So anyway, that's my reflection on this Earth Day.
Yeah, Scott, as you were talking, I was thinking there's kind of two big questions that sort of come up again and again. One is what counts as data? What is relevant? And that's both a legal question and a scientific question. And so answering that question is important. For too long, not everybody has had input into that question about what counts as data. We've discounted entire bodies of knowledge and said that they aren't data, they're anecdotes or they're qualitative data, or, you know, so that's one mistake that we in the science community have made over and over again. And the second part is not just what counts as data, but who gets to collect that data and where do they get to collect it? And that has been really profound for us. We've found cases where simply collecting data in a place where it hasn't been collected before has allowed a community to really make the case that they are experiencing something that isn't being caught by the existing sensors. And for me, that's where sort of citizen or community-led science has been such an amazing and powerful tool to add to the repertoire that communities have. There's a great project called the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project that got community members out collecting data about air quality. And they were able to show that air quality was exceeding acceptable levels routinely in their neighborhoods, even though the existing sensors weren't detecting it because they weren't in those neighborhoods. So they were able to use that data to change the way the Port of Oakland operated, so that the air quality improved in those neighborhoods near the Port of Oakland. So Margaret Gordon, I think, was the name of the leader in that project. Amazing woman.
Thank you. And so, you know, what I'm hearing and what we know as advocates of community support and advocates of environmental justice is the need to incorporate the voices of those who have been impacted in decision making, provide information so that we are effectuating and leading towards self-determination so that communities can be involved in decision-making and outcomes that relate to their homes and their lived experiences, and to validate those lived experiences and back up that information with science and research. So thank you for bringing all of these pieces together in this conversation. So now we want to jump into a few hypothetical scenarios. Before we do that, I want to ask, what can communities do to engage with, one, the Pro Bono Clearinghouse, and two, Thriving Earth Exchange? What does that look like?
So I'll just start and just say that, so I'm dropping in the chat, eli.org/pro bono is our very simple website, and it sort of navigates for you where to go, whether you're a lawyer, a community, a clinic, et cetera, and how you can engage on environmental pro bono. We just launched it, so everything is still sort of getting steam behind it. But for communities, I'll just say the first place that I send them, to be very honest with you, is to Raj, to Thriving Earth Exchange, because I know that the communities that come to me are going to need science, because they mention brownfields, or they mention toxic water, or they mention particulates. And so immediately I know science involved. So I get them on Thriving Earth Exchange and get that conversation beginning. And they have a wonderful website, makes it very simple. But when it comes to the lawyers, we're these lawyers, they're a little odd, right? We encourage the communities to first go, and we provide an extensive list to a clinic, to one of the many environmental law clinics, to see if they can take on their matter, because those clinics are incredible. And if a community can get one of them to take on their matter, that is the best possible situation. It's better than pro bono folks on the side, right? But it also serves another function, which is that clinic is a bit of a vetting system, so that they can see the matter and say, no, this is genuinely viable, but for whatever reason, we can't take it on. Wrong jurisdiction, wrong subject area, we don't have the capacity, we'd love to, but can't, all those sorts of things. They can then bring it to the clearinghouse. The reason we do that is to make sure that some group that has a litigation mindset and a legal mindset has looked at that matter and verified that it is viable. But we show you how a community can do that. We provide all the contact information, and we sort of break down what the clinics are best at. And we're constantly updating that list. And then the minute that clinic says, we can't take your matter on, but it is viable, please come back to the ELI Pro Bono Clearinghouse. We can post it up, and then all of our ELI members and supporters will be able to access the clearinghouse and see these matters and possibly take them on. Now, of course, we can't promise that every matter that's posted is going to find representation. These things take a while. Representation in a lot of these ways, which I think we'll talk about, are long-term engagements often. And so they're not as discreet or sort of simple as some people would maybe like a pro bono engagement to be, but they are fulfilling, incredibly rewarding, and incredibly necessary. I'll also just say on that last point, Ariel, we'll talk about it later, but the community-driven point is the most critical for us, right? And so as a result, we have one gatekeeper to our clearinghouse, which is that you have to watch a wonderful CLE hosted by Ariel and with two amazing community-focused lawyers talking about how to do facilitative lawyering, and that is different than the evaluative lawyering that most lawyers do on a day-to-day basis in their practice. You're paid as a lawyer to quickly conclude things, understand the fact pattern, apply the law, make some assessment, and say it's A or B, go. But that is not at all how you treat a community, and that's not the appropriate lawyering posture when you're doing community lawyering and empowerment lawyering. And so this CLE helps you to understand that difference and begin to get up the learning curve and change your posture a little bit in how you would do that pro bono. So I'll just say, when you're accessing as a lawyer, you will need to watch that CLE, but you also get CLE. It's a win-win. So anyway, I'll let Raj speak to how best to interact with text.
Yeah, so if you're a community leader and you're concerned about something in your community, or you have a kind of a priority in your community, you would simply go to our website and fill out a little form. It's not super long. If you don't want to fill it out, you can actually call us and we'll connect you with somebody who will walk you through filling it out. And then somebody from our team will call you up and just learn a little bit more about you. Then we'll match you with a volunteer. We call them community science fellows, and they're people who have great technical expertise, but they also have a lot of the qualities Scott just alluded to. They're good listeners. They know how to facilitate a thoughtful conversation. They have some cultural humility. They have general humility. And they will walk you through a design process where you'll design with them a project that can advance answer one of your questions, advance one of your priorities. And then they'll go out and they'll recruit scientists to be part of that project. And then they'll serve as project managers with you to manage that project all the way to completion. We try to scope projects that take about 18 months so that one of the things we've heard is scientists are tough to work with because they take forever. So we're trying to counter that. Yeah, that's basically the process for a community leader.
Can I also just insert too that, like, so lawyers and scientists, everybody knows it's like a trope, right? That we are our own sort of breed, right? And we don't interact all that well with those not inside of it, okay? And so you need sort of translators and people that can interact. So the CLE that we just posted and a number of the other points that we've made are about how to transition yourself as a professional in that other direction. I'll also say communities can do a lot to bridge that gap too. And to your point, Raj, about sort of scientists, well, science takes a long time, right? You got to be patient with science. Like it doesn't just pop out, right? Well, in many ways, the law is the same way. And I've suffered the same issue where, God, the law is sometimes the slowest thing in the world. And there's nothing you can do about it. You wish you could speed it up, right? And so if a community doesn't understand the legal process because you're not communicating effectively, they could think you've lost interest in them, or you've deprioritized, or you're just not that good, or whatever, and then this divide can happen where suddenly you meet with them and you don't realize there might be some angst that's been brewing because they haven't heard anything in 2 months. And you arrive and there's an anger. And you have to say, oh, wait, just like literally out of my hands. Like, we just have to wait until that thing comes back. Like, there's nothing I can do in the meantime, And so those sorts of interactions and communications, but also humility and sort of like the patience of recognizing we're all here to work together, that goes a long way, because we're all sort of our own different sort of types of professionals, and we have our own quirks about us, and but we can all work together. And I think Raj and I are, living examples of how the science community and the legal community can come together to support community-driven change that we didn't decide was the right change. We didn't map it up together in our offices. The community determined what they want, and we showed up and facilitated that effort as helpers, right? And that's the very different posture of the whole thing. But it also, I think, in many ways, it changes a relationship in a positive way, because pro bono can often be something that is very transactional. Oh, I need 12 hours like your CLE. I've got to get it and I got to go do it and I get it done and I'm done. The relationships we're hoping to foster. Of course, sometimes there's discrete tasks that a lawyer can come in and do and get in and get out. Maybe a science can do the same thing. But for the most part, what these communities need is long-term support and access to the resources, meaning I'm a legal resource. They can access me, they can call me, they can text me, and I can help them navigate and think and go forward. Raj is a science, same way. And the people at Tex and the people at ELI, when we engage with these communities, thinking about it as a long-term perspective is critical. Because, for instance, at Brownfield, we'll talk about, I think we're just about to talk about some of the issues that communities face that we both, both Raj and I would would sort of bring to bear certain resources. When you have a major brownfield that has very significant toxicity that was developed over, say, 40 years of a tannery that was there, you're not solving that problem anytime soon. I'm sorry to say, there's no magic wand on this earth that solves that problem quickly. So that doesn't mean you have to be there from the beginning to the end of all these types of efforts, but you have to recognize they're always long-term efforts, and you're plugging in to support an effort that's probably going to go on a long time after you leave, and that's okay. You're not going to find some neat resolution to the effort necessarily, but you are going to contribute to the process of things getting better, right? In whatever way that is. And that's important because lawyers are so outcome oriented. God bless us, but we're trying to get to the thing. We want the outcome, we want the ruling, we want the opinion, we want the settlement, you know, and okay, fair enough. That's really not how it works in this space. You know, those don't really happen. Victories are the only victories like that I've seen are small but beautiful. Like we got access to a hearing that we didn't have access to before because we fought for it. And hey, tomorrow we're going to be there, right? Okay, those are victories, but did they get the brownfield cleaned up? No, they did not. They're working towards that. It's helping, but you know, there's no like overnight fix for a lot of these problems. These are long-term solutions that are needed, and those solutions need to be provided by a community of stakeholders that are committed to it, right? And so the communities really need that type of commitment.
Absolutely. So diving into a scenario, say a community member has heard of an environmental issue in their community, or they're experiencing an environmental injustice within their community and don't know where to start to get the help that they need. They've reached out, they've gone to a clinic has told them that they don't have the bandwidth. They've kind of reached out to the clearinghouse. Can you describe a little bit more what are the types of matters that would kind of fit that need, and the way that, you know, the clearinghouse and Thriving Earth Exchange would work together to support that type of service for a community?
Absolutely. Well, I'll give you just a list of the types of issues that they might bring up, and then, you know, maybe Raj can chime in on some that come to him. So obviously toxicity issues are just sort of the central vector here, whether that's in soil, waterways, or airborne. Those are three very different things, and they're often all interrelated. But of course they implicate very different laws. You know, the Clean Air Act is an entirely different world than the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act. Don't get me started. So all that, the complexities between those three are very significant. But any of that is a type of matter that we would take on and we'd be interested in. Essentially, all these communities have inadequate aging infrastructure that's causing watershed management problems. So as we know, flooding is happening all over the country. How do you deal with those issues? Water access challenges, right? That's just the flip side of having too much water. A big issue that we deal with in Bright is blighted property, which is just old facilities that have been abandoned for a while and are sitting around and are eyesores. And, you know, something can be, you know, just need to be demolished. But that could also be brownfields too, and lead to some other challenges. You know, industries trying to come into communities that already have too much to deal with as it is, right? That's a very common thing, trying to keep out another polluter, right? Which makes up a lot of my work at UCI Law. Representation in front of government agencies is a critical one, that communities are finally taking advantage of some of the public participation avenues. And when they go in there, when they're armed with the law, because lawyers are helping them, and when they're armed with science, because scientists are helping them, wow, are they powerful in front of those agencies, right? Just noting that. And then the climate change aspect, that every community is now facing extreme weather and ocean level rise and everything that that brings, which of course the history of EJ is disproportionate burden on EJ communities. Well, the history of climate justice will be told as those same communities bearing the greatest burden. So how we facilitate that with science and the law is are the types of matters that we would take on or we would post at the clearinghouse, and that, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Raj, but that your science group would try to take on. And then I'll just say lastly before I go on is a lot of this work is research and thinking. It's not litigation. It's not going to get anywhere near conflict. You're supporting a community in thinking through major issues as a professional, and you're expanding their capacity. Now, litigation does come up. I'm not going to say that every single matter won't, but I will also say that if you're a good lawyer, you know when litigation could arise, and you know when to sort of indicate that and back away, right? And say, this is that now you're in the litigation zone and you're no longer in the research zone, and there's a difference there, and that's okay, right? And so that supports some of the challenges that big firm folks have with conflicts. A lot of these matters are pre or sub conflict.
Thank you. Raj, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about sort of the way in which I often think about it is that sort of we're coming back to this idea that communities are trying to get something done, and we want to make as many tools available to those communities as possible, and that we want to help the communities know kind of what that landscape of choices looks like and how they want to spend their time. And like a great example for us was we had a community that was concerned about environmental pollution, and scientists had conversations with them about all the different ways we could use to measure that environmental pollution and characterize that environmental pollution. And those conversations were really responsive to the things the community was noticing, the things they were concerned about. It was the second conversation we had where we met with people who were experts on EPA regulations and laws that were in place that really helped the community go from these are all the data you could collect to these are the data we want to collect, because it gave the community insight into how that data might be used and how that data might be influence decisions, how that might be presented to regulators. So I think that combination of, you know, what is the scientifically available landscape of data and what is the legally recognized kinds of data, and how do we find that sweet spot that accomplishes both? And at the same time, the other thing that is sort of exciting is we've seen communities push a little bit to advocate for new kinds of ways of collecting data and new kinds of data to count in those processes. And so that has also been really cool to see citizen data used in decision making in a way that it hasn't been before. And all of that, I think, points towards democratizing who has access to these kinds of things.
Citizen science is huge. I dropped a couple links earlier in the chat for folks about the work ELI has done about citizen science. I want to say one caveat, one important asterisk on citizen science for the folks out there who are considering citizen science. There's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And think about it, it's not all science is not better. Okay. There are certain ways, and this is why the guide that I posted in there and the types of things that Raj is talking about, the type of guidance that his scientists could provide really are helpful, but also how the lawyers can help guide what is right, because a court needs to see certain things. And the science level needs to abide by what EPA needs you to abide by, not some other thing, right? So there is a citizen science that is useful in a courtroom, and then there's a citizen science that maybe isn't, but is persuasive. But you need to know the difference between those and understand that there is a difference.
Absolutely. And so a part of this conversation is the importance of records and of evidence. And so both of these elements are critical and essential notions of law and science. So how does this work establish a record and hard evidence and data to support a community in their efforts to advocate for themselves or to seek remedies?
Yeah, well, I mean, Flint's a great case of this. I keep bringing it up, but it's just well known too. So it's something that I think is in the common parlance. But the science needed to come together to provide the evidence for the lawyers to then pursue a case that said the legal limits had been surpassed, and certain governmental officials knew that, right? But also that on the science side, it was important for them to pursue the legal limits in the quantitative methods that the law requires, right? And that was guided by the lawyers. So it was this massive legal team working with these incredible pro bono scientists, all pro bono, everybody pro bono, that were able to provide enough evidence to show what was really happening there in a courtroom and scientifically in terms of the response, that we need to replace the lead pipes, we need to facilitate the medical health of the people who were poisoned by the lead and the other materials that were in there, how we facilitate the students in education now that they have been poisoned by lead, all of those sorts of things none of that happens without the evidence, without the hard data that the scientists work together with the lawyers to provide. So it really was, that was the sort of the crux to the change that happened there. Even though it's got a long way to go, Flint people still do not have the water they need. God knows it's got a long way to go. But I think we can all agree that it has moved in the right direction because of the public awareness and the lawyers and the scientists working with those communities. Latricia Adams, so many incredible people from Flint who paved the way when no one was listening, right? So that was the court of public opinion stuff. Once they got the court of public opinion loud enough and aware enough, then the actual courts could start being, dealt with. And that actually allowed for the court systems to really hear the case. So it shows you how these things work together, how science is critical in that whole thing.
Absolutely. Raj, do you have thoughts to
Yeah,
add on
I think
that?
a theme for us, we have this idea of open science that the science community is really starting to lean into. And sort of the core of the idea is that scientific data should be available and accessible to everyone. And that science should be part of the public record. And there are places where that is not appropriate. We don't want to violate Indigenous sovereignty. We don't want to damage people because of information that's available. But as much as possible, sort of leaning into this idea that data is out there, and it's not just out there and available, but it's accessible. It's in formats that work for people, that are easy to connect to other kinds of data. And so, we have projects where the scientific work isn't new. It's digging through existing data and offering that to a group of people who didn't have easy ways to get that data beforehand, right? And that's a huge information asymmetry. When you're talking to someone who has a staff of scientists that say, no, this factory is fine, it's helpful to have some scientists on your side to sort of help you access data that suggests maybe that isn't the complete picture. So I think leaning into that idea of high quality evidence that's available into the public record for as many people as possible, and kind of building on what Scott said, it doesn't always have to be the court of record. It can be the court of public opinion. There's this great example. I met this young woman named Stella Bowles. She was concerned about fecal chloroform in a river. And so she started collecting data, and she asked her parents if she could create a Facebook page. Her parents were like, no, you're 11, you can't have a Facebook page. But they let her put up a billboard in the front yard. And every day on the billboard, she would write the fecal chloroform levels in this river. And people started noticing, people started talking about it. And, years later, because Scott's point is right, it takes years sometimes. This was in Canada. The Canadian government actually retrofitted every house along that river so that instead of having straight pipe sewers, there was sewage systems that were built in, right? So, anyway, cool story.
Yep. It's
Powerful.
beautiful.
Yeah. And so kind of along those same lines, how can the relationships of journalists and the role of media contribute to and support the work of attorneys and scientists when working with communities suffering from environmental problems? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, it's really critically important. Back to what I was saying earlier, lawyers speak legalese, and that means we don't always tell a story to lay people very well. And so what I teach my students with EJ is if you're representing an EJ community, you better know a journalist or two, and you better be talking to them because they're probably going to tell the story a lot better than you are, right? And so journalists have always been a major force multiplier for EJ communities in their representation. And it's important that they're working together, that you think about yourself as somebody who needs to be working with journalists to support the work, to get like I said about Flint, it wasn't until it reached a certain level of public awareness. And that doesn't happen without all of those journalists, God bless them, out there covering that beat, right? The other thing is, and I point this out when I teach about trial monitoring, is that lawyers and journalists also face the same danger in their work, which is a contempt of court charge, right? That a journalist, if they try to cover their source, or a lawyer tries to cover up for, to cover for their client, professional, ethically cover for them, they can be charged with contempt of court and actually go to jail for their work, for doing something they ethically believe in. So journalists and lawyers are another sort of professional symbiosis that it has always been there, but I encourage young lawyers to think of as a essential part of their practice in representing communities and dealing with journalists. Raj, what do you think about that?
I'm totally on board. Like, yes, absolutely. +1. And the other thing is there's some really cool movements within journalism that have a parallel to what we're talking about: community-based journalism, community sort of empowerment journalism. Internews runs an amazing program all over the world. The UC Berkeley School of Earth Journalism. These are places that actually have journalistic focus around environmental justice issues. And then from kind of a community up arrangement, there's a project called IC Change, and there's Public Lab, and these are these wonderful sort of community-based efforts that combine journalism and science and law in this very community-driven, it's sort of like the citizen science analog of journalism, I guess is the way I would describe it.
Yeah,
so there's lots of opportunities for alliance between all these different organizations. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just say just like the citizen science, a lot of the reporting was citizen reporting, right? It was literally just citizens on blogs and Facebook, which is just a big old blog, let's be honest. And everything else, but citizen journalism, recording things on videos. Think about George Floyd. What does that do? Right, that citizen journalism aspect has really leveled a lot of things in very powerful ways. I also just want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, Raj, about the scientists on the other side saying that the factory is safe. Don't you worry, right? That in the law is the standard state, meaning what we call in international law, and the U.S. hasn't really picked up on the term, but inequality of arms, which is that these communities are facing insane inequality of arms in the professional setting. In this case, it's the lawyers. You may face, you're representing this one, community, and you may face 10 lawyers from a big white shoe firm, 1 against 10. And the community, and you're pro bono. And 6 months ago, the community had 0 against 10. Right. I mean, this is just the standard. It's always like this. I've never once seen a fair fight where it was actually like even on both sides. Okay. And I think it's the same way it's obviously the same way on the science. You have citizens with no money or maybe like small, like personal funds working together to create citizen science to yield big results versus laboratories, with full paid staff of scientists. It's so difficult to contend with that. And it's part of how government had always been able to poo-poo the concerns of these communities. But wait, you're telling me it's poisonous, but these 40 scientists here that are paid so well said it's not. How am I going to believe you, ma'am? You didn't even go to college. Why, this attitude of you don't know anything about your own lives. Anyway, so that inequality of arms is a big part of why we created the clearinghouse, to try to chip away at that. And I'll also say to address legal deserts. The fact that we have legal deserts in this country when we have so many darn lawyers, right, is insane. But also that in the DMV area, the fact that folks east of the river are in a legal desert, when the people in DC, I think it's 1 for every 2 professionals in DC are lawyers. That's embarrassing, and something I hope that our DMV legal family really starts working to solve, and part of where I hope our clearinghouse works to solve. And this all goes back to that inequality of arms. The justice system is no good if one side has all the favor. It doesn't work very well, and it's certainly not a democratic sort of system. So if we really want good systems, we need equality of arms on both sides, on the science and the law, et cetera. And then we can start achieving environmental justice, right? But if it stays where the playing field is so, unlevel for decades, it's very difficult to see a resolution. But I think that the citizen stuff is what's doing it. We're finally bringing it down because you can't hide anymore. One of the major cases in Louisiana, with a great result, where the community used a drone to take video of the coal that was in fact falling off of the side into the water, into the ocean of a sort of transport system. And that drone footage was what allowed them to pursue their case, right? They couldn't hide that anymore. They tried, they had 20-foot walls. They had 20-foot walls and they wouldn't let you in, and they had security guards and everything else, but that drone got it. So there's a lot of opportunities now that are amazing. Raj's example of the little girl taking the water samples and eventually that leading to the thing. This is real. This is happening all over. Flint and, a lot of young kids led that mission. And that's beautiful and I think new and exciting. And a lot of it is because of having the cell phone with all of its capacity and all of these different platforms that allow for self-publication. But it's just a very exciting time, I think, in the citizen science realm and in the environmental justice law realm to see positive change.
Absolutely. Raj, how do you think law students and non-lawyers can get involved in community work? What are some of the ways that people can do that?
So we get this question a lot from scientists too. How can I get involved in this work? And often the best advice I can give is kind of what somebody told me once, which is show up, shut up, and eat food, and bring food. Sorry, show up, shut up, and bring food. You live in a place. Find out who's meeting in that place. Find out where the communities are. What are the community serving organizations? What are the nonprofits that are active in that place? And go to those meetings. It might take you 4 or 5 meetings of being there and listening before somebody asks you kind of, what are you up to? Why are you here? And when you're there, these are my skills. This is what I have to offer. And that often creates an entree. The other thing, and I think this might be relevant for lawyers too, but often with scientists, the question I get next is, okay, so I'm going to these community meetings and they ask me, what are my skills? And I'm an X-ray crystallographer. It turns out there's not a community in the world that cares about X-ray crystallography. And maybe that's not quite true, but you're not just an X-ray crystallographer. You're part of a big network of professionals, and you have access to other kinds of resources. You know how to read scientific papers. You know how to analyze scientific data. You know how to find scientific data. I think the same sort of general skill sets that you bring as a lawyer and the same sort of networks you bring as a lawyer can be of use to a community. And as you start to earn the trust of these communities, you start to get recommended, you start to get invited to other meetings, and you start to have more and more opportunities. I guess that would be what I would say.
Thank you. And Scott, what do you think new lawyers or lawyers who have been practicing for a long time and want to contribute more to community lawyering work, what do you think these lawyers can do to build a career around community environmental justice support and advocacy?
Well, first join the Pro Bono Clearinghouse and start taking on matters, right? That's a great way to do it. We've sort of served this up for you lawyers, like get in here and get on it. That's a great way. But also, like what Raj was saying, show up, right? These communities are all over the country. You know, I'm here in Silicon Valley. It's so fancy. Well, East Palo Alto, just a few miles away, suffers from all of these problems we've been discussing, right? Right down the street. Get involved. Those communities. What does that mean? Those communities usually have community groups who have been working on this use for a very, very long time. Check your privilege. You don't know how much you don't know. Come in and say, hey, I'm here to help. I don't know anything, but let me know what you know. And before you know it, you'll be surprised at how sophisticated these communities are, and they'll plug you right in. So just be ready, but show up. I also just want to respond on the same line to Sarah Murray, who asked a question in the chat. Law firms, if you're already a law firm ELI member, you automatically have access. You still have to opt into the clearinghouse, but it's right there for you. If you don't have your ELI firm code, reach out, we'll help you get it. If you're not a firm member, then you do need to be an ELI member as a lawyer, because we need to know who you are. We're not going to offer these communities to you as an attorney if we don't know who you are. So please join that way. But also from a firm level, I want to reiterate what I said earlier. So many of these communities need sub-conflict stuff. You're not in the conflict zone. So don't be afraid in the ways that maybe you typically would be about conflicts. A lot of what they need is consultative. You're going to discuss the different options. They need to see what's out there. You can help them with informational research. You can help them with crafting letters to certain folks. This is not conflict stuff. So if a firm is trying to ramp up this work, it's a perfect time to do that. And you can have an education with your lawyers about how to maintain the difference between sub-conflict and where you need to get a conflict check. But please do start taking this work on. Every community in the country has EJ communities who are in every city in the country has EJ communities that are in need of this type of support. Get involved, whether it's through text, ELI. I put a couple other links. Anthropocene Alliance is phenomenal. Environmental Protection Network is another great resource. These are all partners of ours. Get involved. We're here to help, and let us know what we can do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And in the interest of time, I do just want to ask if either of you or both of you have final remarks or things that you want to make sure that people know, or things that you want to reiterate that you've already said to close out this wonderful conversation.
Raj, you're like the guru. So I think we should let you finish us up here.
There's an amazing story that somebody told me once about a court case involving an indigenous community and rights to land. And they asked if they could bring in an elder to testify. And the judge said, sure, you can bring in an elder. The elder sat down in the witness box, and the way I've been told the story, bailiff said, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And the elder said no. And the judge said, wait, do that again. So do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? The elder thought a little bit, nodded, and said no. And finally, the judge said, look, what's going on? We're asking you to tell the truth. Why can't you do that? And the elder said, you're not asking me to tell the truth. You're asking me to tell the whole truth. I can only tell you the part of the truth I know. And I just come back to that story again and again as a touch point for how we can reframe the way we think about knowledges and the way we work together.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that. And so I do just want to thank all of our attendees for joining this incredible conversation. I want to encourage you all to get involved in whatever ways you feel comfortable in this movement. We do need everyone to get involved. There are a bunch of resources on the Thriving Earth Exchange website, on the ELI website. And I just want to thank Raj and Scott for being incredible resources in and of themselves and for contributing to this conversation today.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Scott, Raj, and thank you, Ariel, for moderating. This has been such a great panel discussion and a wonderful way to celebrate Earth Day. So we thank you for your time and thank you to everyone who tuned in. Also, I did want to note that there will be a recording of this posted on the website. So if you have any colleagues who want to watch it but couldn't make it, please look in the next couple days, it'll be uploaded. So thank you, everyone. Have a great Earth Day.
Thank you.